wait for the recording message to come. Okay, there we go. Let me welcome you too. This is the second of a three-part series on our constitutional crisis. We are delighted this morning to have Professor Powell with us, and I will introduce her in a moment. But I wanted to let you know the last half an hour or so of this program is going to be devoted to our own personal wellness. We have two excellent therapists who are joining us from her and out of Milwaukee, and it's important in this time that we acknowledge that this is very difficult for many of us to slog through day after day what is this very real constitutional crisis. So with that, let me introduce our guest today. Eleanor Neff Powell is the Letter and Sciences Nancy Obin Sukenick Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Powell received her AB from Princeton University, MA and PhD in political science from Harvard University. She previously served as an assistant professor of political science at Yale University. She is a scholar of American politics with focuses on the United States Congress, political parties, and the influence of money in American politics. And while her primary research interests lie in American politics, she has secondary research interests in comparative politics and political methodology. Her research has appeared in the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, the British Journal of Political Science, and the Political Science Research and Methods, among other journals. Previously, she served as president of the Midwest Political Science Association and as co-founder of Women in Legislative Studies. We are in good hands this morning, everyone. And with that, let me turn it over to Professor Powell.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm so excited to be here with you today. I'm just going to get my slides going here. And all right. We'll get started. Well, it's a special treat for me to be here with you all today. I've been doing some family history, and I just discovered my great-grandmother was a suffragette activist, so it feels really, really fitting to be here talking to you all about such an important topic. So we're talking here today about the crisis in our legislative branch. I don't think I really need to sell you on the fact that we do have a crisis in our legislative branch, but just in case you aren't convinced, I thought I'd start with some recent headlines. So these are, just from the last week or so. If I were to go back further, we could find even more. We see Congress is losing its grip on the power to spend Americans' money. Congress is supposed to control spending, but increasingly the White House is dictating how America's money is used. As the shutdown drags and Trump flexes, Congress cedes its relevance. It's like we've given up, one Republican lawmaker said. The abdication of Congress. We explain what elected officials aren't doing during the government shutdown. That's just what the media is saying about Congress and what it is and isn't doing. If we look at what the public is saying about Congress, the public does not like Congress. The public has not liked Congress for a very, very long time. Currently, about 15% of the public approve of the way Congress is handling its job. And that's, again, as I said, not new. If we were to go back 10, 15, 20 years, there's some variability, but by and large, the public has hated how Congress has done its job for a very long time. Now, if we turn to what political scientists have talked about congressional dysfunction, congressional scholars have been writing about Congress being broken and dysfunctional for decades. I could take this back much further than the book titles I'm showing you here. But let me just say, starting with the book title on your left, The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track, was published when I was still in graduate school in 2006 and documented all the ways Congress is broken and not doing its job. More recent scholars have been writing about, is Congress broken in 2017? And then most recently in 2024, a group of dozens of congressional scholars and experts published an edited volume, Congress Overwhelmed, documenting the decline in congressional capacity across a number of different areas, measuring it in whole new ways, and then sort of talking about prospects for reform what might be necessary to try to improve or fix Congress. So all of that was happening sort of long before the second Trump administration started. But this sort of long-standing concern from journalists, from the public, and from political scientists about Congress being broken and dysfunctional. So what I want to talk to you today is a couple of different things. I want to start out by talking about the founders' intent and sort of exploring this question about the design of our Constitution and sort of the design of our governmental system and Congress's role in it, and sort of thinking more deeply about, how they tried to create a system for Congress to check the other branches, to check an executive, and sort of thinking about whether they succeeded in that design. Then I want to turn and talk a fair bit about some of the long-term trends about congressional dysfunction. So I mentioned that congressional scholars have been writing for a very long time about Congress being the broken branch, about Congress not working properly. So I want to sort of talk about what are these long-standing trends about Congress not doing its job and being dysfunctional. And I want to sort of separate those long-standing trends about Congress's dysfunction from what I'm going to talk about today is sort of the new and different stuff about Congress really failing in different ways that aren't just a continuation of Congress failing to do its job. That's not to say that there aren't more serious consequences to some of the longstanding ways Congress has failed to do its job in this moment of an executive or president violating presidential norms and longstanding traditions of behavior that haven't really necessitated Congress to do its job in the ways that the founders intended. And then I sort of want to turn to sort of exploring this question about sort of trying to understand why has Congress relinquished its power to the president. And I think it's sort of important to try to understand why some of this has happened, to be able to sort of try to understand, how Congress might be redeemed or sort of how we might sort of shift around this dysfunctional branch that we have. So we're going to try to end on a more optimistic note. That's not necessarily a strength of political scientists in the current moment, but we're going to try to do that before we sort of take some questions and get into the Q&A. All right, so we'll start off with talking about the founders' intent and sort of thinking about this question of how they designed the legislative branch relative to these other branches, right? So if we think about some of the historical backdrop here, right? In an age of Hamilton, the musical being everywhere, I probably don't need to review this very much, right? But, the founders were very concerned about the tyranny of King George and the potential for a tyrannical executive, right? And so they're really thoughtful in trying to think about how can they, create an executive, but make sure it doesn't lead into becoming king-like or authoritarian. At the same time, they had just experienced the failures of the Articles of Confederation and were very concerned about, having a functional national government that is able to actually govern, to have where essentially there was too weak a national legislature, there was no executive to enforce or to implement Congress's will. So they had these sort of two competing recent historical experiences, and were trying to figure out how to design a system to accomplish both of these goals. Now, again, their goals here, right? They're trying to avoid tyranny. They're trying to avoid a president or some sort of American leader turning into a king. They're trying to do that through these separated powers, through checks and balances. But again, they also want this stronger national government. And so to that end, they wanted to sort of try to create a stronger Congress, to make Congress the most important institution, to try to check that executive and to make sure that, a president or the executive is implementing Congress's will, but is not, turning into dictatorial or king-like powers. Right, so the design that they created, right, they created Congress as Article 1 of the Constitution, right, the most important branch, first in the Constitution, right, and the idea, right, Congress is going to legislate policy, the executive is going to carry it out. But throughout, they created all of these complicated systems of checks and balances and separated powers to try to make sure that no branch became dictatorial, right? And we have this, famous quote, of course, from Madison and Federalist 51, talking about ambition must be made to counteract ambition, right? So we can't trust that we're always going to have good or well-intentioned political leaders, Instead, we want their own self-interested ambition to get them to check the other branches. Okay. So that was the design that they came up with. That was the sort of vision. But they're creating this system of government with the sort of presidential system, with the legislature, at a time when there aren't many examples to look at, right? So we often revere the founders and what they did, but they didn't have many examples to look at, and they were sort of creating this from scratch about how to do this. And, in more recent decades, political scientists have really been concerned and noticed a lot of patterns about presidential systems being particularly vulnerable to sort of authoritarian slippage. So these are sort of two book covers from books published in the 1990s, where we saw in the 1990s this sort of expansion of democracy across the globe. We had a lot of new democracies created throughout Latin America, created throughout Eastern Europe. And we, as a government, sort of particularly encouraged them to adopt something similar to our institutional design. So we saw lots of presidential or sort of semi-presidential systems expanded across the globe to these other countries. But it didn't really go so well in most of these cases. Instead, we actually saw, and the political scientists have documented, lots of failures of presidential systems as they were exported to these other countries. And so there's a very famous political scientist, Juan Linz, who sort of wrote this book about the perils of presidentialism. And so what he talked about in terms of the perils of presidentialism, he talked about the concern of dual legitimacy when you have essentially two elected branches, both a legislative body and an executive, and they get in conflict, and then there's gridlock, and sort of what happens in terms of legitimacy when you've got gridlock between these branches. He also noted that presidential systems typically have fixed terms where you can't just immediately get rid of them if they're unpopular or if they're problematic without some sort of major crisis. He talked about the winner-take-all logic of presidential systems, where one candidate wins everything, and how this could exacerbate issues of polarization. Then, of course, we get into issues of personalization of power, where a president becomes the symbol of national authority, and this could lead to authoritarian tendencies if institutional checks, i.e. Congress and the courts, the other branches, are weak. And lastly, the potential for democratic breakdown, where essentially presidential systems are more likely to collapse into authoritarianism than parliamentary systems. And this is a pretty robust finding across lots of different regions of the world, lots of different countries throughout the world. Now, these scholars who were writing about this in the 1990s, this led to this question about the US. Why does the US not have this problem? Why were we so different with such a stable democratic system without sort of the president pushing out Congress or these other branches? They sort of concluded the US has been an exception for not succumbing to the perils of presidentialism. There's a lot of speculation and theories about why that is. But, today the US is looking less exceptional. It's looking that it sort of fits this more traditional narrative of the perils of presidentialism and, the concern about, creeping power of a presidential executive. Okay. But we're here to talk about congressional dysfunction. I just wanted to sort of set that sort of like backdrop about, these systems where a legislative branch is trying to keep a presidential branch in check as being problematic in lots of other examples around the world. So I said I would talk about some of the long-term trends of congressional dysfunction and sort of how Congress is or isn't working well today. Well, one thing that you're all probably very familiar with, because it's in the news a lot right now, is dysfunction when we think about the appropriations and budgetary process. So obviously we're in a government shutdown now. That is, of course, incredibly dysfunctional. There are other reasons why what's happening now is especially dysfunctional, but essentially Congress not being able to budget and appropriate in ways to keep the government open and functioning is sort of a classic failure when we think about the institution being able to work effectively. What is Congress's job? Well, at a minimum, they have to keep government open and running. And to do that, they have to have a budget and appropriate that money. And so when political scientists talk about the effectiveness of Congress or Congress doing its job, They don't have to pass legislation in any given year about healthcare or about other things, but the minimum they have to do is fund the government. But Congress has been really, really bad at that for the last several decades. The process is often late, sometimes really, really late. They often fail to pass a budget. And shutdowns are relatively common. They don't always go on that long, but they're certainly consequential to people's lives, and they're not a sign of a functioning government or a functioning legislature actually doing its job. The second area of congressional failure that I think is actually really easy to miss, and I think we don't talk about it very much in terms of the media or in terms of attention, is that many laws and programs, policies that Congress creates, they create them in such a way that they actually expire after a certain number of years. And if they're going to continue, they have to be passed by Congress again, sort of called a reauthorization. And Congress does this design deliberately to try to, force itself to, like, let's check how things are going. The world may have changed. We want to make sure maybe we need to change this policy to see if it's not working well, to sort of have this plan to revisit things that they've created, to shift it if it needs to be done, shifted, tweak it, etc., or end it entirely. Maybe we just want to try it for a few years and then it'll go away. So this is built into the design of lots of types of laws in covering lots of different things: laws, programs, policies, etc., where essentially it could be 5 years or 10 years, but Congress is then going to have to revisit it and reauthorize that policy or program. Well, Congress has kind of just stopped doing that. They just let these things expire, laws, programs, and policies, and then, but they still appropriate money for them. So it creates what I call zombie policies or programs, where they actually kind of still stay open because Congress still funds them, but they're not actually authorized in the law. And so it's a really weird, like, not fully legal, certainly not functional system about how this process is supposed to work. And so increasingly, it used to be Congress would sort of, I think about this as like falling behind on their workload. They might be like late or behind on, a few percentage of things where they haven't really done the reauthorizations that they need to do. Well, now we're getting up into the territory of 20 or 30% of essentially unauthorized, of discretionary spending for the whole government are these unauthorized programs. And so this is really dysfunctional. It's really borderline legal and certainly bizarre and not as intended for how Congress is supposed to work, and a very clear sign of Congress not fulfilling its legislative responsibility. Congress doesn't want to reauthorize these things or want these things to end. They should stop appropriating money to them. But instead, we get this weird middle ground where they're not reauthorizing, but they still want to keep it going, so they still fund it. But it just doesn't make any sense, and it is incredibly dysfunctional and leaves a lot of potential discretion for an executive to interpret things in different ways, because essentially, what do you do if the program's no longer authorized by law, but you still have money to spend on it? And so there's a lot of ambiguity and potential for an executive to make different choices there. There's also been a very well documented trend in Congress declining to oversee the executive. This is a long-standing trend over 30 years. I can show the sort of declining number of hearings, length of hearings, number of things Congress is investigating, where Congress is not fulfilling their job of overseeing the executive branch and all of the things the executive branch is doing. Essentially, the number of oversight hearings has really trickled down to an incredibly small number, with just very little congressional attention to oversight, and big differences between when there's unified government or when there's divided government. So when we have divided government is really the only time we tend to see Congress trying to check the executive, right? So when we had, a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, then we see some oversight hearings. But otherwise, if there's unified government, there's basically nothing happening. Other trends in terms of congressional dysfunction, we can talk about a real failure to negotiate, to compromise, to avoid gridlock. Instead, Congress seems to just get stuck and they can't come to any agreement and nobody wants to budge. Everybody thinks the other guy is wrong. And rather than trying to solve the problem by coming to some solution in the middle that could actually pass, even if it's not the dream policy, they want to keep it as a campaign issue. And so they want to sort of deliberately not give the president or the other side a win. And so we just keep failing to solve America's problems because Congress keeps wanting to then be able to campaign on those issues next time around. So there's a political scientist named Francis Lee who's written about how this is a result of insecure majorities. Essentially, now that control of Congress is often at stake in ways that it didn't used to be before the 1990s, when there was basically no doubt the Democrats would continue to hold the House and the Senate because of the large Democratic majorities. Now that control of Congress flips between the parties basically every cycle or two, members of Congress sort of engage in these message wars of they don't want to give the other side a win and they want to campaign on how the other side isn't doing this right. And so they're just going to engage in rhetoric and messages and talking about how the other side is terrible rather than come to some sort of compromise and actually pass legislation. In addition, this gridlock and an inability to do anything encourages presidents to engage in unilateral executive action, right? Because they'll say, well, we've got this problem. Congress isn't doing anything. Congress is abdicating their job. So I'm going to pass an executive order. And the trick with executive orders is, presidents can only do them if they're not contradicted by a law or what Congress says. And so if Congress isn't going to do anything or pass anything or contradict the executive, it just gives more bandwidth to encourage the executives to engage in policy work through these unilateral actions, and then B, Congress isn't doing its job to sort of push back or check these executive orders. We also see some really extreme partisanship and polarization, where essentially members of Congress are valuing the party, what members of their party want, above everything else. So above sort of any sort of considerations about, what might be good for the country, what might be good for Congress, the institution, to preserve their institutional power. Instead, it's just party over basically every other consideration. And if you're not a loyal party member, they will punish you and try to push you out. Another sort of long-standing trend about congressional dysfunction is that Congress decided several decades ago to get rid of a lot of their staff. So we saw, starting in the 1990s, massive cuts to congressional staff, particularly staff that gives Congress information and helps provide them with resources to essentially either investigate the executive or to make more informed policies when writing legislation. So this became a trope, a campaign thing to try to, we need to cut Congress, we need to cut government. And the way they would do that was cutting their own resources in their own information. So we saw really big cuts to the staff size, the amount of staff, how much they were paid. Information staff was particularly hit. They also engaged in cuts to agencies that provide Congress with their own sources of expertise and information, so they don't rely only on information from the executive branch. So things like the Congressional Research Service, the Government Accounting Office, the Congressional Budget Office, they either had cuts to their resources or their workload is dramatically increased with no additional increase in staff. They're just asked to do incredibly more with less. The staff is also very poorly paid. A lot of the staff in member offices are young. I mean, these are 22 to 25-year-olds. They don't know a ton. They're maybe really well intentioned, but they don't have a lot of institutional memory. They don't know how the system works well. They don't have a lot of substantive expertise either about the institution or about substantive areas. Once they get that expertise and serve a few years in Congress, they often do what's called the revolving door. They can't afford to live in Washington, even if they want to engage in government service. And so what do? They go become lobbyists, they go work in private industries, and then provide those resources, that expertise and experience they've gained to these outside entities. And Congress has this brain drain where the people, once they learn something that's useful, they're then more valuable elsewhere, and Congress doesn't pay them enough to stick around. And a lot of these people really do care about government service. They would stay if they could afford to live in DC and keep doing these jobs, but they're paid so poorly, they're put in a position where, if they have kids and have to put their kids in daycare, all of the sort of life expenses we all experience with the rising costs of everything, they're just sort of forced to go out there in all the ways. Sort of related to this is Congress has increasingly delegated a lot of policymaking responsibilities to federal agencies, right? Congress doesn't really have information or bandwidth to do this themselves. They don't have the expertise. And so what they do is they write laws in such a way that, the bureaucratic agencies that are charged with carrying them out are going to make a lot of the policy making decisions, a lot of the rulemaking, a lot of the specifics get figured out later. Now, maybe if you think bureaucrats are just like technocratically, like, implementing Congress's will, maybe this isn't as much of a concern, but it concentrates a lot of power in executive agencies and creates a potential for agencies to act in ways that Congress might not like or might not intend. And so Congress could be more precise in writing their laws and retain more control and not give as much power to these agencies to make so many decisions about the substance of the policy. But of course, to do that, they would need more information, and they already got rid of their informational staff. And so we sort of have these two things that are sort of reinforcing in their problems. And then, the last trend I really want to emphasize here is Congress is spending less time legislating, right? They spend less time in Washington. They spend less time passing bills. They're doing a couple of other things with their time. So they spend more time in their districts back home with their constituents. Now, maybe from a representational standpoint, time with their constituents and making sure they continue to know their voters back home isn't terrible. But it means they're not spending as much time in Washington doing the legislative work. They often also have to spend so much time fundraising that crowds out a lot of their time that they could be spent legislating, right? The cost of congressional campaigns in the House alone for just not even competitive races, you're still talking $1 million or $2 million. That's a lot of money for a member of Congress to raise. They often start raising, fundraising when they first get to office. They continue to fundraise throughout their terms. As we all know here in Wisconsin, these costs of these campaigns can go much, much higher than that. And, these Senate races can get incredibly expensive with, tens of millions, 50 million, $100 million. They have to spend time with FaceTime with donors to get that money. And that means they're not spending it doing other things with their job. There are only so many hours in the day. It also means they're, not networking with their colleagues, doing all of the other things that Congress used to be able to do to make things work. Okay, so that's a lot of long-standing dysfunction about how Congress has been broken and continuing to be broken for a long time. I want to note that I do think it's worth reflecting on the fact that the implications of congressional dysfunction and these long-standing types of dysfunctions, may be different in the current environment when you have an executive breaking norms. It could be that, some of Congress's dysfunction didn't have huge consequences for the lives of everyday Americans or even what Congress intended, because executives sort of behaved within the rules of the game and sort of played by the norms of how presidents had behaved before. But if we think we're in a sort of slightly different world now where norms are being broken and boundaries are being at a minimum tested, the implications of Congress failing to do its job are very different now than they might have been 10 or 20 years ago when they were doing some of the same things, failing to do their job, but the consequences were different. Okay, so I promised that I would also talk a little bit about the sort of new and different dysfunction that we're seeing today with Congress. There's a lot of things I could talk about here. We only have so much time, so I made some choices about a few things I want to particularly emphasize and highlight. We can certainly talk about, a host of other things in the Q&A later on. One of the things that I think is most important to talk about is essentially Congress ceding control of the power of the purse. You know, when we think about the design and powers that the founders gave to Congress, one of the most important ones was control of the money, right? Control of appropriations and the budget. And we're seeing that control just completely disappear through impoundment, through rescission, through pocket rescissions, through agency shutdowns and firings, to shut down RIFs, reduction in forces. So I'm going to talk in a few more slides, like really to dive into this process, because I think it's so important and actually so hard to understand. The congressional budgetary and financial process is incredibly confusing. My students just took a midterm. I think they would tell you that the budgetary process is complicated and confusing. And so we'll sort of talk a little bit more about this, but I want to highlight, I think this is sort of one of the most important ones where it was dysfunctional before, but this new stuff is completely different and has really different consequences for how we understand Congress having any influence over the what happens in government. Next, I want to talk about Congress not pushing back against the president's abuse of emergency declarations, right? And we've seen emergency declarations happen in a bunch of different areas. That's sort of how the president is doing what he wants in terms of tariffs and other things. But from a structural standpoint, how that's happening is interesting. It used to be when Congress created a lot of these emergency powers for presidents, they put safeguards in for those emergency powers so that if Congress disagreed about whether an emergency situation was happening, they could overturn the declaration of an emergency with just a simple majority in one chamber. But in 1983, the Supreme Court ruled in INS versus Chadha that this was unconstitutional, that a one-chamber simple majority to overturn a presidential declaration was unconstitutional given our design of sort of checks and balances, and Congress and the executive needed to, agree on things or, override a veto. So now we're in a world where to overturn the president's declaration of an emergency, Congress has to override a presidential veto. And it is extremely hard to override a presidential veto just in general, right? The threshold is incredibly high, and with unified government, almost impossible. And when the president has what we call sort of a first mover advantage here, right? They can essentially declare the emergency, and then Congress has the burden of trying to sort it out and then trying to overturn it. And that's really hard to do. But the president gets to act first and do this declaration. And so Congress is in a tough position here because to push back would be really hard to overcome a veto of these declarations. But Congress not pushing back against these emergency powers creates this really problematic situation where it's not clear what the threshold is for an emergency to have been met. And it doesn't seem like Congress cares that in some of these cases, the actual evidentiary basis for an emergency being declared at a minimum does not seem strong. The other thing that I want to talk about is essentially the incredibly expanded scope and scale of executive orders. So we've had executive orders for a long time. There have been presidents that used executive orders a lot. One of the presidents that used executive orders the most was FDR. As part of the New Deal, there was a lot going on then. Obviously, there was World War II. There was the New Deal, etc. But we haven't seen a president use executive orders the way this president is using executive orders, at least since FDR's time, in terms of the scope and scale, the number of orders, and then how wide-ranging they are, and how it certainly seems like several of them contradict laws on the books or other restraints, but are still being implemented. So we're seeing expanded scope and scale really at an unprecedented level. And then I'm just going to say not pushing back against a host of what I'm going to say are major norm violations. So things like politicization of the Justice Department. We could go on and on about the number of other things here. Maybe we'll talk about them in the Q&A, but they are substantial and certainly consequential, and though in a handful of cases, individual members have expressed concerns. By and large, at least with regard to members of the majority party who are in control of what Congress does, we see really no serious effort to push back against any of these pretty serious violations. Okay, so I promised I would talk more about this power of the purse problem. This is really Congress's big tool, right? The big power they're supposed to have that's supposed to keep everybody in check, right? So the founders intended Congress to be the major holder of the power of the purse. We can point to the specific language in the Constitution, right? Where Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, no money shall be appropriated from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, et cetera, right? This was all supposed to be the power of the legislative branch. These funding bills and other things were supposed to have to originate in the House of Representatives. This was supposed to be Congress's big cudgel with regard to the executive branch, because how can the executive branch do anything without any money, right? That was the story, that was the design of the founders. Well, the power of the purse has become problematic, right? And so, President Trump signaled this during the campaign. He indicated that he was planning to, quote, restore executive branch impoundment authority to cut waste, stop inflation, and crush the deep state. I want to talk a little bit about what impoundment is and sort of what it's supposed to be, and then what's sort of happening now. So what is impoundment? Impoundment is the executive or president refusing to spend funds appropriated by Congress. So the history of impoundment, sort of prior to 1974, is occasionally presidents would engage in some limited impoundment. Now, the examples here are pretty small in scope, so I can point you to an example. 1803, Jefferson declined to spend $50,000 Congress had appropriated to build 15 gunboats on the Mississippi. Why did Jefferson do this? He said the military threat that had prompted the appropriation had disappeared, so he was going to save the money. Now, this wasn't contrary to that particular appropriation law, which had authorized but not required the spending. In other examples, presidents in earlier years have impounded funds despite statutory language that made the spending mandatory, that required presidents to engage in the spending. So we get this pushback from Congress about impoundment in 1974. So we see President Nixon really dramatically change the use of impoundment. So he was impounded a lot of money from social programs that Democrats favored and had passed, right? So previous examples of impoundment had been pretty modest, the sort of slightly too large ones about the military, and often the impoundment was sort of done with tacit congressional support. We're just going to save a little money. The need for spending the money had disappeared, so we'll just sort of do the reasonable thing and reduce the waste. But Congress got really frustrated by Nixon's overuse or arguably abuse of impoundment. So in 1974, Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act. And what the Impoundment Control Act is at least supposed to do is it limits executive branch authority to decline to spend or to commit to spending funds that Congress has appropriated, right? So there are other statutes that prevent the executive from spending money without a congressional appropriation. So things like the Anti-Deficiency Act, which is a 19th century act, make that unlawful and in some cases criminal. But the Impoundment Control Act is about sort of trying to prevent the executive from declining to do what Congress has told it to do, right? So you might be saying, but I'm seeing lots of impoundment happening today. How is this happening? Well, the 1974 Impoundment Control Act seems to prohibit it. Despite that, President Trump has engaged in substantial impoundment in his second term. Now, the rationale that he's giving is he is arguing that the 1974 Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. And he argues that there was precedent of impoundment by presidents prior to the act, and that there should be, like, Congress shouldn't, like, that law on the books is illegal, and so he should be allowed to do this. Now, we are clearly heading for some sort of Article 1 versus Article 2 conflict heading to the Supreme Court. I'm not going to wade too much further into this because I know you have a briefing coming up with the Supreme Court experts who I'm guessing may talk about some of these things, because this, or how this gets sorted out, will be a really important decision for Congress's role in our national government and Congress's ability to check an executive. So that's impoundment. I want to just talk briefly about what's called rescission, which is an alternative to impoundment. So the Impoundment Control Act created a process to reduce the budget called rescission. Now, what rescission is essentially a process that the president's supposed to be able to go to, where if essentially the president thinks they were given too much money for something, they can send a request to Congress to rescind the budget authority, essentially tell Congress, like, approve taking this money back. And the president is supposed to list the specific budget provisions he'd like to rescind and explain why. So maybe the circumstances are no longer needed, whatever it is. Maybe they got the guns for cheaper, whatever it is, right? And then Congress is supposed to vote on them. If approved by Congress, then the budget authority is removed and agencies can't spend the money, right? So that's sort of the process that was created to try to be this alternative to this sort of unilateral impoundment. Now, we have a history of rescission. It was used extensively by President Reagan in the 1980s. So in 1981, obviously the first year of his presidency, he proposed 133 rescissions. Congress approved 101 of them. We also saw President H.W. Bush use rescission. And he sort of had this productive back and forth with Congress, and the eventual package of rescissions passed with both chambers and huge majorities, right? So everybody was on board about, there's some waste here. We can reduce this waste by cutting spending in these different ways. Now, rescission fell into disuse with President George W. Bush. We saw President Trump try it during his first term, but it failed because of essentially a lack of coordination with Congress, that Congress wasn't on board with the things he wanted to remove. This changed, of course. In July of this year, we saw the first big rescission package pass. So H.R. 4, the Rescissions Act of 2025, rescinded $9.4 billion, with pretty substantial cuts to the State Department, USAID, public broadcasting, and a host of other priorities the president thought were, liberal leaning and not important. Okay, so that's sort of my quick introduction to what impoundment and rescissions are. I did just want to note that impoundment and rescissions do a couple of things, right? So they undo previous recent negotiations between Congress and a president, right? Where essentially, these are money, like when they're giving money back that Congress appropriated, they just struck that appropriation usually within the last year. And so this isn't as if like this is some long outdated thing. Like, these negotiations around the budget are really hard for Congress and the president to come to. And to just undo them so quickly is challenging for how Congress is going to continue to engage in future negotiations, right? It undermines the ability to craft these deals, right? So it makes it harder for Congress and the president to negotiate in the future, because how does the minority know that the president isn't going to just undo the agreement 2 months later? And so why would they give their votes to something when it could just be undone without their, without their consent, with just the majority later on? And so it creates this problem where it was hard enough for Congress to appropriate things and to come to agreement with the budget. Now that things, like, once deals are struck, they can just be undone in the subsequent months. Congress didn't used to bother to do these things because they could just do the budget differently than in the next year, and it was hard enough to do the budget in the first place. And so if they wanted to change things, they would just change it in the next cycle for the most part. Well, now things can be undone at any time. And so there's sort of chaos where there's like lots more on their plate if you're just constantly doing these rescissions, but it's also much harder to come to any agreement because you never know what agreement's actually going to be able to stick when one side can just renege on the agreement at any time later on. Okay, so that's a lot of dysfunction to be talking about. I want to talk a little bit about sort of why Congress has relinquished this power to the presidency. These are longstanding trends. Political scientists have been interested in them for a long time, why Congress has been doing this for a long time. And then, of course, we've got the new stuff that Congress has also been doing. And so why has Congress been relinquishing so much power to the presidency? Well, some of the explanation has been about essentially deliberate shifting, that essentially as the nation's political economy has expanded, the need to offload some of the governing authority to the executive has just like there's too much to do, right? Like the government is too big, it's too much for Congress to wrangle. And so they've given some of this over to executive agencies because they have sort of more capacity to handle this big, complicated, messy country. Some of Congress's relinquishing power has been sort of crisis induced, right? So essentially Congress has created a lot of these emergency powers. You know, they're sometimes created in a situation where some crisis has occurred or they're worried about some crisis occurring. They're supposed to be really limited in scope. And when they passed them, they thought Congress was going to be able to take the power back really quickly. So if there was a disagreement about whether there was an emergency, Congress put this stuff into the statute that they could just a simple majority, one chamber, take it back really quickly. But the Supreme Court undid those provisions. And so we have these sort of provisions on the book where Congress didn't intend to do this, but now the protections Congress put into place have been removed by the courts. And so Congress is in a much weaker position. And once Congress has ceded power to the executive, it's really hard for Congress to get it back because essentially of the veto power. So if Congress wants to take power back from the executive, they have to overcome a presidential veto, and that requires big bipartisan majorities in Congress, and that is really difficult to come by in an era of polarization when essentially one side is always in power, and why would they want to take power away from their side? And so this creates this sort of asymmetric problem where Congress might give away power for various reasons, but it's really hard for Congress to ever get it back. So we see the executive get a little more power and a little more and a little more and a little more until Congress really can't do much about it. You know, we talked about Congress's sort of recent inability to perform basic duties, so budgets, programs, etc. You know, because Congress sort of fails to do its job, we sort of see the executive like take over more and more of what Congress is doing when Congress is being incompetent. And so maybe we'll do more executive orders, maybe we'll do all of these other things because Congress is sort of not functioning well. Perhaps the biggest issue, at least in our current situation, our current configuration, is unified government. So the founders were pretty concerned about the power of factions and the power of political parties. You know, the system of checks and balances they created only works if Congress wants to check the executive. But in unified government, where one party controls both the executive and the legislative branch, there really isn't an incentive for the majority in Congress to engage in checks of the legislative branch. And so this creates this real problem for who's going to stand up for the powers of the institution when your side is in power. The president also has this sort of first mover advantage in a lot of realms of American government, where essentially they're the ones who control what government's actually doing. And so they can often do stuff and then find out if they're going to get in trouble or wait for Congress to try to stop them from doing it. But once the president has done something, right, they like change the state of the world, and then Congress is in this playing catch up position that is really hard for Congress to be able to back out of and to sort of get the control back. So that's all pretty bad. That's pretty problematic. I want to try to leave us on a slightly less despondent note about the legislative branch and the dysfunction in the legislative branch, and talk sort of just briefly here about, potential for Congress to be redeemed and sort of what that would look like. So there are some solutions that would be maybe not solving everything, but might help Congress. So the sort of low-hanging fruit solutions are things like improving congressional capacity. So, you could try to reverse some of the decades of cuts to congressional staff. Those cuts, were so big in the 1990s, they were referred to as the big lobotomy, like taking the brain away from Congress. You could give them some of that informational resources back. That would help Congress to be able to have information, to conduct oversight hearings, to be able to write more detailed laws that wouldn't cede and delegate so many of the details to the executive branch. You could pay staff appropriately. So have the staff fund the agencies that give information to Congress. Make sure that it's possible for staff to actually have a living wage and retain that expertise. So you're not just losing all that expertise to the corporate sector, to the lobbying world, where then the people with the information are on the outside and Congress is on the inside, and they either need to get their expertise from the executive or from these outside lobbyists. So give
Oh,
Congress
yeah,
its
that's gonna be
resources
normal, I
back
think. I know, oh, yeah.
internally. And
That's
then, the third thing to sort of strengthen and improve congressional capacity would be to sort of, again, strengthen Congress's information sources and their investigatory resources. So staff all of that up, give them a little more budgets. In the context of the federal budget, you're talking about like not even rounding error in terms of dollars spent to do this, but potentially things that might make it a little easier for Congress to do its job. Now, I'm not naive. That is not going to solve all of our problems by any stretch of the imagination. And so if you're saying that's all well and good, but there are bigger problems here, I don't disagree. I think, the bigger issue here is sort of changing the incentives for members of Congress to act, right? So that can happen in a bunch of different ways, right? One of the issues we have right now is members of the majority party don't want to check the president, who also shares their party. Those incentives obviously would change in an instant with divided government. But you could also imagine, other circumstances if voters, if members of Congress and the majority party thought their voters cared about this, they might do something different, right? We don't see that now, in part because of what members of Congress observed to Republicans who voted and supported impeachment during President Trump's first term, right? Those folks who supported impeachment were pretty much all voted out of office in primaries, and they were electorally slaughtered. And so that's created a real fear among Republicans of the majority in Congress, who might not like some of the ways in which their power is being usurped, but they're terrified electorally that if they push back against a popular member of their own party, or someone who's at least popular within the Republican primary electorate, they're all going to lose re-election. And so this is a sort of incentive problem that is really problematic, and this sort of isn't functioning the way the founders intended, with sort of ambition checking ambition, right? We need essentially voters to help change the incentives. One of the really interesting puzzles of the current moment is sort of trying to understand why congressional appropriators haven't objected to impoundment or rescissions. Members of Congress, some of them wanted for their whole careers dream of being on the Congressional Appropriations Committee. It's one of the most powerful committees. It influences, they have a lot of power to be able to send money back to their district, to influence what the government does and all sorts of policy areas that they care about when you control the appropriations process. Well, why haven't majority members on the committee objected? Well, what we're seeing essentially individual members of the majority being able to go to the White House, and then the White House says, oh, I'll give you what you want for your district. And so those members are getting what they want for their district by going around the process to the White House. And nobody else in Congress gets to do that, but it means that they're not objecting to sort of preserve the power of the institution, or to preserve the power of the appropriations process or their job. And so this problem, this sort of going around the process to the White House to get what you want, and then they're sort of giving money politically to sort of route to their supporters, has created this system where Congress isn't objecting. But if you can change these incentives, if you can get these appropriators to care about something different, maybe you could sort of get Congress to sort of start pushing back in various ways. But to me, if Congress is going to be redeemed here, this is all about voters caring about what this process looks like. And so voters learning about it, we're in a world with siloed information environment and misinformation. It is very hard for voters to get reliable information about what's going on, about Congress and what government is actually happening. And so, trying to change this process to me really starts with the voters. And maybe if the voters do something different, maybe Congress would then have the incentive to actually do their jobs. So maybe not the most optimistic note to end on, but I'll leave it there. I'd love to answer any questions or hear any thoughts that you all have.
Thank you so much, Professor Powell. We will go to questions and answers. We'll start with the questions that are in the chat now. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Anastasia Saluna to direct the questions toward you. But please, everyone in the audience, keep asking your questions, and we will avail ourselves of Professor Powell's knowledge.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Professor Powell, you can stop sharing your screen as well so we can see you a little bit bigger.
Sounds great. I will do that right now.
Thank you. I'll start out with some of the questions we had about the historical background that you offered. The first one being, what were the reasons the US historically was deemed an exception as a presidential system, and what are the positive ways that could stay intact?
Yeah, so this was the big puzzle of the 1990s, is this like American exceptionalism. Why were we so different? Some of the things people talked about were sort of our norms of and precedents that the earliest founders had established. So things like, Washington stepping down from office, the sort of like ethical rules that people followed, this idea that people are sort of trying to stay within the system and that democracy is important and these values in the Constitution were really important, and this respect for the Constitution. And so one of the things the US sort of tried to export with this was sort of our constitutional design. And when our constitutional design wasn't going super well, it's like, oh, well, then you need to have like respect for these norms. And how do we get that? And what does that look like? Is that about an educated population? Is that about certain values? There were sort of lots of explanations political scientists tried to offer. I'm not necessarily sure. There wasn't necessarily agreement about exactly why the US was the exception. In hindsight, maybe we just didn't have long enough years sample size, and now we're sort of having some of the same problems other countries had. But it is noteworthy how long those norms held and how much respect for democracy and the rules of the game and the constitutional process there was for so long. And maybe if we can sort of try to return to some of that, there's a big movement in a lot of educational circles about like return to civics and education about our American government and educating voters about why this process works the way it does and what are the values of this process.
Amazing, thank you. And you've sort of been touching on it, but do you think that the presidential systems are more prone to falling into authoritarianism? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think that seems to be the pattern we see around the world. Teasing out cause and effect is really hard and messy when countries are so different for so many reasons. But I think the record seems to suggest that parliamentary systems typically are a little safer and are less prone to this sort of authoritarian expansion. I see this as, concentrating the power so much in one individual and making that individual hard to remove, which isn't true in a parliamentary system, right? Where there's a prime minister, but that prime minister is removed from office where the government would fall if there's a vote of no confidence, and there's sort of a faster process there. And sort of the party has more control over that prime minister because he only is in power through the votes of the parliament, and he could be removed by the parliament himself. And so the president has this like separate power base from the voters, and it's really hard to remove. I think all of those things, make it more possible for this concentration of power in the executive. And then when we think you add that to all of the longstanding dysfunction that's led to our presidents getting more and more power, it just creates this sort of vulnerability in the system.
Absolutely. Thank you. We had one question that was, who is really in charge? It seems as though there's, a number of select people who pull the strings over the executive branch, which in turn holds the strings over the legislative branch. And how does the Supreme Court's failure to adhere to constitutional principles play into this?
Yeah, I don't think we fully know who's in charge right now or what the limits are on the executive power. I think we've seen lots of examples of executive overreach from the president. I'm sure lots of things were, done by advisors of the president, staff of the president. There are a lot of court cases challenging some of this overreach. Those are going to end up in the Supreme Court. I'm not an expert on the Supreme Court, and what this particular court's going to do on a lot of those cases sometimes seems contrary to what I would expect given some of the rules on the book. So I will leave that to the great Supreme Court expert you all are going to hear from for the next briefing. But I think it is a really important question, and trying to think through I think a lot of the Supreme Court's rulings have really big implications for not just the power of the president, but the balance of power between the chambers, and whether Congress is going to have any tools to be able to check an executive or a president.
Absolutely. There were a few questions in the chat that boil down to what can be done if one of our branches refuses to perform the checks and balances like we're seeing here, especially in this administration that makes demands of loyalty. Can citizens take the step of implementing an impeachment process? Do we have other avenues?
So there's no impeachment process without Congress. And so with a majority controlled by the president's party, I think that is extremely unlikely in the current moment, sort of regardless of whether one thinks it's appropriate or not. I do think there are avenues, for potential influence. I think, these court cases in some cases have had an effect, in some cases an immediate effect. I think that is a really important way forward to try to rein some of these things in. It's often complicated about who has standing and what intermediate rulings look like in the meantime, and lots of things can happen before the courts take action. But I think that's a really powerful tool, and I think lawyers are sort of leading the way and sort of trying to preserve, what the rules are on the books, and sort of trying to keep some of those constraints in place. I think the media can play a powerful role, and the media, I don't just mean like ABC, NBC, New York Times. Those outlets are really important, but they reach relatively few people. We're in a world where social media is really important, and so getting information to people about what's happening, I think the president's done a really powerful job of portraying his actions in different ways to his supporters as necessitated by crisis, sort of building this narrative about why it's important or what it's doing. I think getting people information about other interpretations of those actions and what they're looking like are really important roles that all citizens can play. I think the voters are going to be ultimately the only ones who can check the president in, the near-ish term, and I think that's a really powerful place to be in. I will say one thing that we've seen, and I sort of alluded to this, is for a long time, actually, individual members of Congress have been able to help their constituents with the federal government. So this is actually one area that my research is trying to look at how members of Congress work behind the scenes with federal agencies to help their constituents. Sometimes this is about constituency service, sometimes this is about policy work or oversight, etc. But if you're a constituent and you're having problems with the federal government, or you think the federal government's not doing something appropriately, you can go to your member of Congress, your House member, your senators. They can reach out to the federal agencies and try to get assistance or help or intervention on your behalf. Now, the president, and we just saw an announcement the other day that the Department of Defense is trying to prohibit anyone in the Defense Department from talking to any member of Congress without the White House's say so. But putting that sort of new limitation aside, members of Congress do have the ability to try to do at least small scale interventions behind the scenes. Members of Congress historically have been able to do this with ICE, with name your social security. Like, often these things are can be sort of like minor technocratic things, right? Somebody's having trouble getting their social security checked. They go to the member of Congress. The member of Congress intervenes with social security, tries to help cut through the red tape and get an answer or a solution to people faster. So that's a thing that most people, I think, don't know about and aren't appreciating, that still sort of works. I'm not saying it's working as well as it used to, but it's not totally dead. And I think getting information to your members of Congress about what problems you're having with the federal government, what is or isn't working. We know we've had all sorts of staff cuts across different agencies, but getting information to Congress can both help you potentially fix the specific problem. Like, if you can't get somebody at Social Security to pick up the phone for you, but they can also potentially try to put this on their to-do list of like things they need to staff up or things that they need to try to figure out. So some of these staffing cuts we've seen the White House implement, staff has been hired back when problems arose. Sometimes they got blowback from members of Congress who are saying, like, this isn't working for our constituents, there are problems here. And so I think those methods of sort of feedback of, I call this in my work sort of like the hidden parts of the democratic process, where like members of Congress do this sort of intermediary role to help their constituents with the federal government, that isn't totally dead. And there are still potential pathways there for resources that I think people often don't know enough about.
That's really interesting to know. We had a couple of semi-related questions about what to do about, legislators who aren't doing their legislative duty and what we can do. One question was about whether we can impeach legislators as citizens. And the other was, why can't states create their own term limits for members of Congress?
Yeah, so these are both really interesting issues. There isn't really a way for citizens to impeach a legislator. Technically, like, Congress can get rid of their own legislators sort of through similar processes, but that's probably not the solution that you're looking for there. So once they're in office, it's pretty hard to get rid of them. The question of term limits is a really interesting one. That's actually one that I think that what the research says is really different and counterintuitive relative to what people think. So often people think that term limits are a good way to get rid of legislators that aren't doing their job. And I can totally see the rationale there. But what the research says, so there are lots of state legislators that have tried term limits at the state level for the state house. But when they've done that, what ends up happening is it actually ends up making the executive, in those cases the governors, more powerful, because essentially Congress loses even more experience and knowledge and capacity about how to work the system. And so what state legislative term limits tend to do is make an executive even more powerful. So I think in the current moment where we might be concerned about executive overreach, I think term limits, though they sound appealing to try to get legislators to do their job better, I think would have a counterintuitive effect of actually making the executive even more powerful relative to Congress.
That's really interesting. In that sort of vein as well, in these cases where the legislature gives power to the executive branch, and then it's really hard to claw it back, what is the motivation on their part to cede that power away? especially if they know it's really difficult to get back?
Yeah, so I think first of all, they don't often realize how hard it is to get back, right? So, they didn't realize the Supreme Court was going to overturn the simple power they put in place to be able to return power, to like revoke a declaration of an emergency. And so Congress doesn't always realize how hard it's going to be to get back. And that's, I think, part of the problem. I think other reasons why they give their power away is they sometimes don't know what they're doing and they're overwhelmed, and so like, oh, we'll just let the specialists and the technocrats in the agency figure it out because they have expertise. And a lot of the bureaucrats in these agencies are incredibly hardworking experts, want to make things better for people, want to carry out the law, and like do sort of just like technocratically want to do and figure out the details for Congress. But once you've given it to the agencies, who controls the agencies? Ultimately, that's about the president. And so we've seen variation over time, and certainly under the current president, about how independent these agencies are. So some agencies, at least used to be, considered completely independent. Presidents were never supposed to intercede. And so maybe in those circumstances, maybe it wasn't as concerning to like let the specialists figure out the details in the weeds, right? And some of these things really do get technocratic in the weeds, right? It's like members of Congress are not experts on like the latest like AI legislation and like don't understand like the specifics of how that works. Maybe you want people with like real substantive policy expertise to be able to write those things. So that's sort of, I think, part of the rationale is like, let's let the experts do it, but the experts are overseen by the president. So once the president starts to get involved more politically with that process, again, it's essentially just more power to the president, even if they thought they were giving it to these sort of like, bureaucrats in the agency who would do responsible things. And so I think being more thoughtful about what they're doing, I think, we also didn't see as much abuse or sort of violations of norms in previous years. And so I think Congress might have just gotten a little careless is maybe a strong term, but they weren't as worried about some of these abuses because they seemed so far beyond what could be possible. But I think everybody's eyes have been opened up about what's possible and what to be concerned about. And, they may think differently about some of these choices in the future, but we're in a world now where they've given so much away. How do we get it back? And what does a reset look like? And, is that possible?
Well, speaking on the expertise, we had one person wanting to confirm that the lobotomy of congressional staff happened during Reagan's term. And then, are there any rules about Congress shrinking and underpaying the staff?
Yeah, so there've been lots of moments of lobotomies that have been cited at different points. So I wouldn't dispute the 80s. More happened after the Reagan or the Gingrich contract with America, Republican Revolution in '94. So we can point to lots of those. So I certainly wouldn't dispute exactly where we want to date this to. Congress, I mean, they pay their staff a minimum wage, right? Like they're not violating like labor laws in that sense. So there are a lot of limitations in terms of like that bottom dollar. It's just very hard to have, people who have really valuable knowledge and expertise stay in these jobs when they're so poorly paid. And so I think, again, you could do some relatively straightforward things to raise their pay, which again, drop in the bucket for the federal government. There aren't a lot of rules in place otherwise about sort of what Congress does for staff. They can shrink their staff if they want to, and they've chosen to do that often for symbolic gestures about shrinking the size of government, and we're going to start at home with like our own branch. And so that's sort of often how these things are portrayed. But in practice, sometimes that'll give more power implicitly to party leaders because they're the ones who sort of sometimes retain some of the staff, and sometimes party leaders like having more of the knowledge and keeping some of their legislators in the dark about the process. So sometimes this can be about like leaders versus rank and file or regular sorts of members. But I think giving some of that information and resources back to Congress might be potentially a place to start.
Thank you. We had a few questions about the money aspect of everything as well. Will you address money in politics, billionaire, corporate foreign influence, and also is the shrinking of congressional staff and an increased reliance on lobbyists for expertise related?
Yes, so yes to all of these things. So money in politics is one of my research areas that I certainly happy to talk about. Money in politics is certainly a big deal. I think it matters in lots of different ways. I think one of the ways it matters is how members spend their time. I think, members have to spend so much time with donors and trying to fundraise that even if you think it affects nothing else, it affects how they allocate their time. And it's time hearing the concerns of donors. And there's been some research that shows that legislators are often more responsive to the concerns of donors, or often don't have really accurate views about what their constituents want. Some of that research shows that those views are sort of skewed in a more moneyed or conservative direction. Part of the mechanism of how legislators could be wrong about those things could be about just spending more time with donors, and not that there's anything even malicious about it, but just that's what they're hearing. That's the concerns that they're hearing. That shapes their perception of the world because they talk more to donors than they talk to regular people. And so that has that effect of just shaping their worldview, shaping what they think is possible, shaping what they think the political dynamics are. But that also means they're not spending time legislating, they're not spending time helping their constituents or listening to their constituents. And so all of those things have an effect. I think it would also be naive to think that donors don't, especially really large donors, don't want something in exchange for their donations. How big a problem that is messy to show and hard to document, because essentially it so easily moves into corruption and nobody wants that to be visible because you get into the illegal world. Although the Supreme Court rulings are such that it is actually very difficult to convict any politician of corruption given the standard that they've set, because essentially, unless you get somebody like on tape with quid pro quo corruption, or like having gold bars sewn into their pocket in their coat, which does happen, right? Senator Menendez is an example of this. It's not that it doesn't happen, but the evidentiary barrier or requirements are pretty high to convict people of corruption. And so there's a large gray area of, I think it's not unreasonable to think that donors might want something, but we don't know whether or what members of Congress are giving. In my own work, I've tried to look at patterns of donations to see if they're consistent with donors giving for access or sort of wanting to get something from government reasons. And so one of the things that I've looked at is, looking at there's patterns that donors engage in. So like what happens if they're a donor in some policy, they're interested in some corporate policy area, and they've been giving to one member and that member loses their seat on that committee. So they lose influence over that policy realm. Well, what happens most often is we see corporate donors who care about policy in that area start giving to the member of the other party who then gets the seat on that committee. Right. And given how polarized and ideological things are, it's like pretty hard to reconcile that giving pattern with anything other than wanting to get access to people who are influential over the policy process that you care about. Right. You're sort of consistent with this sort of concern about money in politics. It's not the smoking gun. It's not saying this contribution led to this outcome. That's really difficult to show. And we don't have a lot of evidence that shows it, but we're certainly seeing this story. Now, in the current moment, we're seeing some like really blatant examples of corruption a little bit more on the White House side, because essentially that's where the power and influence is really happening. We're not seeing maybe quite as blatant examples of that on the congressional side. because Congress really hasn't had the power to do stuff. So why would you sort of waste your efforts on that side as much? But it's really hard to say how bad this process is getting in terms of this influence, but I definitely think it's sort of an area for concern, and I think it's probably increasingly a larger problem, but it's hard to say even quite how bad it is.
Absolutely. Thank you. We only have time for a couple more questions, and everyone has been putting such amazing questions in the chat. I'm being asked to look at a dessert table and only pick two. I'm going to pick something that might be a little bit less on the general public's radar. So it seems like Congress is poised to repeal the 2002 Iraq War resolution. Is this a hopeful sign that Congress might be trying to take back certain powers, cede less to the executive?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting example to think about. So, I didn't talk about it very much today, but one of the powers, right, technically, right, Congress is the one who has to declare war, and presidents can't unilaterally engage in war. We've had lots of sort of military conflicts or military incidents that aren't directly tied necessarily to a new war declaration, but what often happens is we get these occasional declaration of wars or conflicts, and then for the subsequent decades, Congress, if the White House wants to do anything, they'll note back to that earlier congressional delegation of this. So we think back to like the Iraq War or these other things, those sorts of things are still being used to justify military conflicts today because they're still on the books. And so one of the movements is, well, maybe we should rescind those authorizations to be able to like rein this in, so we can't just be in a perpetual state of war and conflict without those approvals. It will be really interesting to see whether Congress actually follows through and does that. The Republicans in Congress, some of them are, kind of anti-interventionist, and so I could imagine a majority of members doing that, supporting it, but it's sort of, to me, going to be a question of whether the White House is going to oppose that effort, and can they deter their members from not just voting for it, but can they deter the speaker from allowing it to be brought up for a vote? Because one of the really important powers that the majority leader has on the House side is they control the agenda and they can keep things off the agenda. The only real exception of a way to force a vote in the House without the majority leader's say so is through a discharge petition, which has gotten a lot of attention in recent weeks, even though it's something that is one of those like arcane procedures that I'll teach in my class and that nobody ever really wants to learn about because it's used so rarely. But we may be about to see an example of it. Congress is very close to reaching a majority of signatures on a discharge petition, which would move a piece of legislation out of committee and immediately force a vote on the floor to release the Epstein files. And supposedly one of the reasons why Speaker Johnson is being, we're going to politely call it slow, to give the oath of office to a member who was recently elected by a special election is supposedly her vote would push them over into 218 votes and then force a vote on releasing the Epstein files, which a lot of Republicans do not want to take that vote, let alone the fact that it might actually pass. So we shall see what happens with that. But it is a really important power of the majority party, and currently the Republicans, to like prevent Congress from doing things by controlling what is allowed to be brought up for a vote in the House. And that makes it hard, even if there are a majority of members might want to do something, to be able to force things if the majority leader isn't on board.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I would love to wrap up Q&A with what you would like us to do with all of this information. As everybody has been saying in chat, you've given us so much great information, so much great perspective on this process. What do you want us to go and do with it? How can we make change?
I mean, to me, change starts with the voters. And so I think you all are informed about this. You all do an amazing job of keeping informed. I think, one of the amazing things I think the league does is provide information to voters and to get information out about how things are working, and having trustworthy sources of information about the democratic process is just essential and so hard to come by now. And so whether it's talking to friends and family about it, whether it's providing voter guides, whether it's canvassing and getting people out to vote, it's sort of doing the things that you all are already known for, I think couldn't be more important in the current moment.
Thank you so much, Professor Powell. It has been an absolute joy to learn from you this morning. Of course, I hope that it's okay to give people your contact information if they have additional questions, or I'm happy to pass them along. But thank you again so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. And now we are going to move on to the second part of our presentation this morning. We are going to hear from Carmen Fontanas and Lexi Longer at Her Wellness. And this is sort of our opportunity to take a deep breath, to acknowledge that this is heavy work. It affects us all. Right now, pretty much on a daily basis, and to just remember that league members and our board members you guys are volunteers. And so we are extremely grateful that you make up this grassroots organization, and that you are willing to sort of face these really hard things that are coming at us every single day, these affronts to our rights. And so we have invited Carmen and Lexi here to talk about some ways that we can take care of ourselves and others. Gene Roberts coined this wellness first aid, which I think is great. So I am going to introduce Carmen and Lexi. Carmen Fontanas is Puerto Rican, German, Polish, and French, and a survivor of sexual assault and intimate partner violence. She serves as clinical director. She oversees clinical therapy services and therapeutic programming. She is a healing-centered therapist and provides direct therapy to victims of crime with a culturally responsive, relational, and trauma-informed approach. She facilitates both individual and group therapy and incorporates sound therapy, brain spotting, emotional freedom technique, and Reiki into her work. And Lexi is a bisexual, gender-flexible woman of Uchinanchu. Tried my best. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And Japanese ancestry, and a survivor of violence. Lexi serves as the sexual assault advocate at HER, which stands for Healing Intergenerational Roots Wellness Institute, which is located in Milwaukee, and you can visit it. So I'm sure Carmen and Lexi will speak to that. She is a woman and survivor-led HER is a woman and survivor-led nonprofit in Milwaukee, like I said, that offers cost-free, comprehensive mental health services for Indigenous and historically underserved communities and survivors of violence. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Carmen and Lexi. Oh, and then I think you guys had some slides you wanted to share too. So we'll wait just a moment until Lexi's able to pull those up for us.
All right, can everyone see the slides?
All right. So yes, thank you so much for that introduction. This is the wellness component to today's workshop. And so we will be having about 30 minutes talking about wellness and things that we can do to heal our heart. So welcome everyone. My name is Carmen Fontanes, and I am the clinical director at Her Wellness Institute. Like they mentioned, HER stands for Healing Intergenerational Roots. And so on behalf of our team, I would just like to thank you for bringing us into the space today and for inviting us to share a little bit about what we do. Because we come from a trauma-informed practice perspective, it is important for us when we are new to a space or new to a group to balance both wellness education and practice. This way, if there's anyone who is part of your group who may or may not be fully ready for wellness or healing services, they have the opportunity to take this session in the way that they need. Before we begin today, we want to invite you to take this information in the way that best serves you. If you want to sit back and not participate, we welcome that. If you want to fully dive in and embody the practices we share today, we welcome that as well. So with that little bit of a disclaimer, are we ready to begin? I think we're ready. All right.
All right. So again, we're Her Wellness Institute. We are a place to heal. Our mission is to provide access for free mental health and victim advocacy services for Indigenous and underserved survivors of violence. We are a survivor and woman-led organization that specializes in trauma recovery, grief work, specifically complex grief work, intergenerational healing, and post-traumatic growth.
There we go.
Oh, sorry. Can you see it, Carmen?
Yes, no, I can.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, it's a little delayed. So today's agenda, we have just about 30 minutes to have some of this wellness in practice. We're going to be moving at a faster pace, so just wanted to let you guys know that we really encourage you to use these practices and take a little bit of a slower time with them. But our approach, we're going to talk about community activated medicine framework. Our teachings, we are going to do the heart of service, which is slowing down and body mapping. And then we're going to have 3 core 60-second or less activities to support that slowing down. So our first activity is going to be body mapping, and our second is heart math. And one of the techniques from heart math that we're going to be incorporating is quick coherence. And the third is going to be emotional freedom technique. Then after we practice those, then we're going to do our closing practice and have some key takeaways. So our community activated medicine, our CAM framework, this was developed by our CEO and founder, Leah Denny. And the community activated medicine framework is really a transformative practice-based approach that activates healing within individuals, families, and community. So we say, the people are the medicine, you have medicine within, I have medicine, and together we're able to be that medicine for our community and heal in those relationships. So through the CAM practice, we're able to advance mental health care through relational health, have that intentional slowing down that we're talking about today, be culturally responsive, and operate in an interdisciplinary integrated team, which we do at Her Wellness, creating those healing-informed environments that address the pervasive effects of persistent toxic systems and environments. So a lot of that just to say that this is the framework that we work through at Her Wellness Institute, where we believe that the people are the medicine and together we can heal together.
All right, so this is the wellness lesson 1. So again, my name is Lexi. I'm our sexual assault advocate, and beyond being our sexual assault advocate, I am a very, very proud member of the League of Women Voters, Azaki and Washington County. So shout out to you folks. I saw Judy and I saw Christy. Hi, friends. But today we're going to talk about the heart of service. So navigating grief and moral injury in civic and advocacy work. So, we were talking, Professor Powell did a beautiful job talking about just what's going on in the legislative branch and how challenging things have been for those of us who are staying up to date on things or staying engaged, doing the connecting with our communities. That can be really challenging and really heavy. So for those engaged in civic leadership and advocacy, such as all of you, such as all of our league members, witnessing injustice, voter suppression, barriers to equity, this can be profound emotional and moral strain. And so when we think about being in these spaces of, civic engagement, we want to prevent burnout, because the reality is the world needs you, the nation needs you, the state needs you, right? Like that, this work is so essential um, to maintaining our democracy. So when we're thinking about everything that we're carrying right now, the way we like to navigate this type of grief work is recognizing that the heaviness, um, that's part of the process. It's not a weakness. This is acknowledging it, looking at it, sitting with it is part of preserving your well-being and being able to continue the work, the beautiful, powerful work that you're doing. And so the way that we approach this is through acknowledging and working on collective grief, anticipatory grief, as well as disenfranchised grief.
Okay, so we were talking about slowing down, and so we are going to invite you all to take that time to slow down today. And it's one of our key principles of CAM. So taking time to intentionally slow down is essential to healing. And I know that probably sounds really like, what? We have no time to slow down. We got to do all the work. But we really need to slow down in order to refill ourselves. And like in a world that moves too fast, slowing our pace, even when uncomfortable, creates that space for restoration and repair. And we deserve to have that time to slow down and refill our cups.
All right, so the first activity that we're going to do, so this is the lesson part. This is an activity that we like to do called body mapping. So essentially, this helps our relatives, which is what we call clients, because we're really relationally centered at Her Wellness Institute, and we, again, provide our services at no cost for the people we serve. So we use relatives. So the goal is to help our relatives gain a better understanding of their physical sensations happening within their bodies. And so we're going to do a body scan, which is a gentle check-in. You're going to be invited to be curious, notice anything any physical sensations that are happening within your body, connect to a few points in your body, what feels cool, warm, tense, uncomfortable, numb, quiet, itchy. I'll have another slide with like a list of other things that might come up for you. And then we'll invite you, like on a piece of paper, to kind of draw or sketch a representation of your body and what the sensations are on that piece of paper. So this is mapping out your inner signals. So again, something like, we're not going to be naming the emotions today. That's going to take a little bit more time than the half an hour we got. So instead, we're going to like really just sit with the sensations and like find them in our body, acknowledge them, and then hopefully release them. So we're going to start with addressing them. So we're going to look at things like tension. Are you feeling butterflies? Are you feeling flooded in your body? Do you feel tingly? How are you feeling with the temperature? Is there any pain? Is there any weight that you're carrying? And then I also have a little bit of, some scribbles and swirls. Maybe that's visually how you're imagining those things in your body.
Okay. So with all that information about how, connecting with our body now, we're going to take about 30 seconds to practice slowing down. So get comfortable, have your feet flat on the floor, and we're going to do just a gentle body scan so we can notice the sensations we're feeling in our body. So follow your sensation. I invite you to breathe in and out, allowing yourself to simply notice without following your thoughts. So just do a gentle breathing in and out. You can move to a few more spots in your body and repeat the slowing down practice. Taking breaths in and out. To connect to these sensations with compassion. If needed, tending to it through stretching, maybe massaging, tightening, and then releasing. Then when we get to our body map, we can mark where we feel these sensations, and then you can represent them visually in a way that reflects how you feel.
I'll give us a few more seconds before we move to the next slide. All right, so we're going to tune in and we're going to use that body map to restore balance and prevent burnout. So here's mine. I did this body map just before we all started today. So I am on top of working, on top of being a league member, I'm also a graduate student at UW-Milwaukee. So this has been midterm week. So here are the things that I'm experiencing in my body right now. My eyelids are heavy. I'm holding some tension in my arms. With the world being as it is, I'm holding some tension in my heart and chest space. My tummy's feeling a little bit knotted up. I'm feeling a little disconnected, a little numb, from my lower half of my legs. In the way I drew it, one of them is blue for some reason. I feel like that's really accurate. And my shoulders are on fire, and that sounds absolutely accurate. So as I kind of talk through that, I'm wondering how those things are feeling for you. So I would like you to sit and like reflect on that as we move forward.
Okay. So one of the practices that we incorporate at Her Wellness Institute is heart math. And heart math is a research-based approach and a set of techniques designed to help individuals regulate stress, build resilience, and strengthen that connection between heart and mind. So it's a form of biofeedback, and it really helps to shift into a state of coherence where we're more aligned, balanced, emotional, mental, and physiological symptoms that support optimal functioning. So it really helps in different ways to reduce our stress, improve focus and decision making, enhances our heart rate variability, and we may know how that is really key into supporting our cardiovascular health, promotes calm and clarity, and strengthens our overall well-being and capacity to manage life's challenges. And one of the many different techniques of heart math is called quick coherence. This is a practice that you can use anytime, any place, and it just is 3 simple steps. Again, a lot of these steps kind of rushing through, but I'm going to try to slow down a little bit so that you can really take that time to embody it and see what that feels like inside. And again, we encourage you to practice these exercises and take a little bit longer with it, at your own time. So this quick coherence technique involves 3 steps. So I invite you, what I like to do is to kind of warm up my hands. So I get the energy flowing, warm up my hands. And then I invite you to place your hands on your heart if you feel comfortable. And just notice and focus your attention around your heart. You can keep your eyes closed or open. Just notice the area around your heart. Maybe you notice that your heart is beating fast, or maybe it's at a regular pace. Maybe you're noticing the warmthness of your hands. Second part is heart breathing. So I invite you to breathe deeply, but normally, feeling your breath coming in and out of your heart area. Count slowly to 5 as you inhale, and slowly to 5 as you exhale to help you gain deeper, healthier rhythm. Take another breath. Well, and then we're going to focus on the heart feeling part. So as we continue to take our breaths in and out, I want you to think of something that brings you gratitude. Could be a positive feeling or a special place, person, could be a pet, or experiences that are important to you. So I invite you to hold this feeling for about 20 seconds as you do your breathing in and breathing out. And that is quick coherence. It's something, again, that we can do anywhere we are. You don't have to place your hands on your heart. I just like to have that sensation. But you can just take a couple deep breaths, and it's just heart focused, heart breathing, heart feeling. Eliciting those feelings of gratitude or positive feelings can really help shift our focus and bring a sense of calm to our nervous system. This is another practice too that we do. It's called emotional freedom technique. Sometimes people call it emotional freedom tapping because we're going to be tapping. And so it's a mind-body practice that combines acupressure tapping and therapeutic strategies by tapping gently on different meridian points in our body. So this can really help reduce stress, anxiety, and emotional intensity. EFT really helps to support our nervous system regulation and fosters emotional release, promotes a sense of calm and resilience. I can tell you sometimes when I'm driving, and especially if I'm driving through Illinois, no offense to anybody from Illinois, but I can tell a lot of times that, my nervous system is very activated. So although I may not go through all the different parts, I do a lot of like tapping like this. And that really helps to bring a sense of calm within. So we will be going through this together. And again, we have, I'm going to be repeating our words on here. We're just going to go through it one time. I invite you to do this again on your own and go through it usually 3 times. We do a round of it. It could be a mantra you have for yourself, but it's usually talking about a feeling that maybe like an overwhelming feeling, like anxiety or sadness, grief. But even though we're feeling this way, we can have a positive feeling with that. And while we say this mantra, we're tapping on our different points. So I'm going to walk you through this. And again, I invite you to practice with me. So we're going to start with our left hand, and it's like a little bit of a chopping motion. So even though I feel overwhelmed by what's happening in the world, I deeply and completely honor how I feel right now. And we switch to our right hand. Even though I feel grief and anger about injustice, I choose to meet myself with gentleness and compassion in this moment. And we go to the top of our head. This heaviness in my heart, it's so much to take in. I feel the pain of the world in my body. And we go above our eyebrows. Sometimes I feel hopeless or small. I feel grief for the people and places being hurt. Go to our cheeks. I feel grief for the future I wish existed right now. I honor this deep ache and everything it carries. We go above our lip. Here. Part of me wants to look away. Part of me wants to stay engaged. I feel torn between needing rest and needing to act. We go on our chin. I'm so tired of carrying all this heaviness. It's okay that I feel this way. It makes sense that I feel this way. Then we go to our collarbones, both sides. My care is a reflection of my humanity. It's because I care that I hurt like this. Then we're gonna extend our arm up and kind of go on this side down here and just tap. I can hold pain and possibility at the same time. I can feel what's true without losing myself to despair. Then we're gonna go on the other side and do the same thing. Breath reminds me I'm still here, still capable of love, even when the world feels broken. Love still lives in me. So then I invite you to take a couple deep breaths in and out at your own pace, knowing I am allowed to rest. I am allowed to grieve. I honor my grief as a sacred response to injustice. I choose to move forward with courage and compassion.
So now that we've done those practices, I kind of want us to return to our body map. So checking in with ourselves, kind of running through the sensations in our bodies now. I have some reflective questions that if you just want to sit with those questions, to do a check-in. So, what did you notice? Like, were there any areas of your body that now feel more present or heavy or light or quiet? Did anything surprise you? Or were there sensations that changed as you gave them some attention? So for me, I mentioned that like my shoulders were on fire. Fire is out now, feeling more safe. And I'm also noticing, I mentioned before that I was feeling a little bit more disconnected from my legs or my lower half of my body. And I'm now realizing that they're a little achy. And I think because a lot of us are carrying such a heavy load, we sometimes disconnect from our bodies. And we have to remember we are a whole self. We're not just our mind. We're not just the thoughts we think, but we are a whole self. We are a body mind. So I hope that this practice helped kind of help you feel more reconnected and come back to who you are. So living wellness is a practice. It's not a destination. So like we mentioned, all of these, practices that we brought in today, these are things that you can tap in on your own. When you're ready for it, when you're ready to invite some of that calm and slow for yourself. So some of those things are to, slow down intentionally throughout your day. Here and there, all it takes is a couple moments sometimes. You don't always have to follow your thoughts. You can acknowledge them and let them go. Focus on your heart, focus on staying connected with yourself. I would love if we all were able to find our own ways to slow down and fold them into everyday life, fold them into the work. because we need you, the work needs you. This is part of that prevention burnout or burnout prevention and sustaining this work. And then if you're able to, integrate listening to your body's sensory signals, they can be really wonderful communicators to how we're doing, not just with mental health, but our physical health. And it helps us be mindful of what we're dealing with in terms of chronic stress. So this is our wrap up and thank you. So take good care of your heart. It carries your courage, your compassion, and the love you give to others. So nurture it with the same tenderness you offer the world. I would love to invite you all if you want to get involved or want to connect with us further. We are hosting our 9th annual Community Activated Medicine and Red Sands event on Friday, November 14th, 2025 at UW Milwaukee. Our Cameron Red Sands event is a community grief event and awareness raising about missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. We are often not taught how to grieve in community spaces. We're also often taught to not grieve, that nobody wants to deal with it, that you need to suppress it. And so at this event, we are offering a space for holding each other up, holding each other in strength and community, and also talking about the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. In addition, we are having our inaugural gala, Rise Together, a gala of healing, honor, and hope that we would love to invite you to. It's many years in coming, and so this year we are actually going to do it. I'm very excited. I've gotten to be on the planning committee for it. So this year we are deeply honored to celebrate the extraordinary achievements of our CEO and founder, Leah Denny, who will be awarded with an honorary doctorate from UW Milwaukee for her contributions in community mental health and leadership. So this is going to be at Turner Hall Ballroom on December 20th, which is the solstice, from 5 to 9 p.m. The QR code right there is a way to access the tickets. If not, please go ahead and follow our socials. And then in honor of our domestic violence survivors that we work with, and in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we are offering a 25% discount off of our gala ticket prices. So we have the code Together25, which you can input at checkout if you'd like to join us. And let's stay in touch. Again, if you have any reflections that you'd like to share with us, or if you would like to talk or ask questions about any of the practices or any of our services, or if you'd like to get involved, or if you'd like to have us back, go ahead and reach out. We would love to hear from all of you. But yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen and Lexi. I personally really enjoyed learning those techniques. I saw some of our other fellow participants going through those practices with you together. And of course, this will be recorded and made available. So if you need it to be a little more guided, sort of speaking to the audience here, like that's available for them in the future, which is a really wonderful resource. So thank you so much for being here, Carmen and Lexi. And I hope that some of you, if not many of you, will avail yourselves of their upcoming opportunities to participate in some cool events. So that is a wrap on today's, sorry, I'm just stopping pins here. So many moving parts. That is a wrap on today's session of Issues Briefing. Again, thank you to Professor Powell and Carmen and Lexi for being here to share with us. A reminder that I've dropped the feedback form in the chat. So if you care to share your input on the sessions thus far, please take advantage of that. And a reminder that our final session of Issues Briefing on the judicial branch will occur on Tuesday at 6:30. So you won't want to miss it. We're hosting Professor Vladek from Georgetown University. So without further ado, we are perfectly on time. I love that. So I'm going to close this meeting and I hope to see you guys on Tuesday. Have a wonderful day.